Hello everyone, welcome to our last set of modules here. We're going to be concluding with Romanesque and Gothic art. And our objectives for these last couple of sections, we're going to explore the emergence of Romanesque and Gothic architecture, as well as emphasize subject matter. We will also assess the cultural and social impact of monasticism and pilgrimage on design, and explore the interest in telling stories of human frailty meant to appeal to feelings and minds of viewers. So this is the region we are in here, and of course this is Europe, and we are going to be focusing particularly on some Spanish as well as French examples primarily, even though there are more examples in your text. We're just going to be taking that focused, concise approach that kind of reviews key ideas from our study guide. So a little bit of context here about Europe during the Romanesque. William the Conqueror became England's new king in the 11th century and replaced Anglo-Saxon nobility with Norman nobles. There are also aggressive rulers, particularly around the end of the 12th century, who began creating national states. And this is also the age of crusades, as the Western Church launched a series of holy wars against Islamic powers. So let's discuss the importance of pilgrimages. So Romanesque means in the Roman manner. And we see here the Cathedral of St. James, the exterior here, but what is significant about this, a couple of key ideas. This was the first trans-European movement, and it was also a great period of building, glorifying the saints. So architecture integrated, and we'll see this when we look at some interior views, solid masonry walls with rounded arches and vaults. And this, of course, focused on castles and churches to house relics that would accommodate large crowds. So what we see here on the left is we see again this exterior of the Cathedral of St. James at Santiago de Compostela. We see pilgrimages that are a way of demonstrating religious servitude and devotion. So you have holy sites such as Jerusalem, Rome, and what we see here, the Santiago de Compostela, receiving many visitors with relics and religious art. If you want to read a written account of what it would have been like during the age of pilgrimages, and a fictionalized account, there's Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. And this offers this fictitious account of a group of pilgrims going to the Canterbury Cathedral. And some of these characters on the journey are not necessarily pious, but it kind of gives you a sense of Chaucer's take, at least, on a pilgrimage. So let's continue here. Let's look at the interior of this structure here. So here again, we have the interior of the Cathedral of St. James, and this is the view towards the crossing. And this would have been constructed around 1078, 1122. And this site is important because it was the burial site of St. James, and this is in Galicia, Spain. And many significant pilgrimage routes, as most notably the Camino de Santiago, converge here at this site. And churches like this would have been very impressive. Cathedrals like this would have been very impressive for travelers to make a difficult journey that could have been wrought with illness, thievery, and potential dangers. So the cathedrals such as this had to be impressive, and they also had to be built and rebuilt to accommodate the volumes of the pilgrims. So builders designed the pilgrimage plan, where you have vaults covering the nave, the aisles, and the galleries. And this is evident here. So we see how some of the vaults relieve stress on the side walls and allow for large windows, which we will really see kind of continued into the Gothic. So here you have some of the vaulting here and some of the construction that's referenced in this section. So let's look at this diagram here. This is a diagram of a church interior from your study guide, even though we're not spending as much time here on Saint-Sernin. This particular site here shows us architectural features that symbolically represent Christian ideals, through architectural form, such as the form of the Holy Roman Cross that we see here. And the transepts, for example, emphasize this. So here we have the transepts that cross through. And we also see, once again, as one of the driving ideas of architecture during this time, and one of the main incentives for renovating architecture, was to accommodate pilgrims through sites like these, where they would be able to enter and navigate through spaces such as the ambulatory that you see here, without disturbing the Mass. So these terms are the ones that are on your study guide. You have the nave, which of course we see on the diagram, the part of the church between the chief entrance, choir, and the part that is separated by aisles. You have the transept. This is the part of the cruciform church that crosses the main axis at right angles. And this also gives the floor plan as well as a structural kind of reference to the Holy Roman Cross. And we see the apse in the front here. And this is an often semicircular recess, at the end of a Christian church. And some of the vocabulary regarding architecture you've had on previous lists, which is why I'm not repeating ambulatory, even though this is still a relevant function. So let's move to one of the next concerns here, relics. And of course, this is defined a little bit later, particularly when we discuss the Gothic a little bit later, and it is also on your study guide under the vocabulary section. But first, let's kind of think about what the text says about this. Let's see what we remember about relics. So feel free to consider this, kind of engage with this a little bit critically, and pause this if you'd like. So what are relics, and why are they important to pilgrimage sites? Think about this. So we've read about how pilgrimages brought a lot of prosperity to the regions with cathedrals and religious sites that house these relics. Relics, as it is stated on your vocabulary list, are bodily fragments or objects that have come in contact with the body of a holy figure. So these are usually kept in reliquaries, as we see here, basically small precious shrines. The example that you see here is not in your text. This is known as Reliquary Arm, quite descriptive title here, and this is from Belgium, but it is now at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Cloisters, which I really recommend visiting if you are in New York. So this particular reliquary arm, is believed to hold relics of the arm of a saint. So the reliquary housing these relics is obviously meant to reference visually what is inside, and the bronze and silver materials reference the importance of these as holy remnants. So another reason that relics were particularly significant to pilgrimage sites, they were coveted because they justify the expensive construction of cathedrals, and this could be very controversial. And there were even alleged holy robberies, which was the theft of relics for spiritual purposes, allegedly. So sometimes a relic would disappear from one church or cathedral and mysteriously appear in another one. And a spiritual leader within the church where this missing relic had kind of manifested itself, allegedly, would basically claim that the saint spoke to somebody in the church in a dream possibly, and somehow asked to have his or her relics taken to another church or cathedral. So this is where this belief in miracles and kind of a suspension of logic, as we might think of it, kind of comes into play. So this practice of relics, reliquaries, and constructing churches and cathedrals around these, as well as the controversies surrounding these, including holy robberies and holy theft, this was popular in medieval Europe, and pilgrims would visit churches to ask special favors or seek the miraculous power of these relics through Romanesque and Gothic periods. So additionally, too, you have to kind of wonder, think of all of the other interests in attaining these relics as well, too. So relics and the cathedrals built to house these could bring a lot of prestige and a lot of wealth to a specific region. So let's now move to another important feature that is on your study guide through the site, and a vocabulary term here, the tympanum. So what this is what we see here, an enclosed space over a church doorway that often has religious narratives as you enter the church. So what we see here is the south portal, and this tympanum shows Christ in his majesty, and this is at Saint-Pierre in Moissac, in France, of course. So let's consider what the tympanum portrays. So a little bit of context on this and the importance of narrative before we kind of see what is portrayed here. Innovative portals are among one of the greatest artistic achievements of this period, and we see this through this tympanum, for example. And pilgrims would encounter these narratives as they entered the church. But before we kind of discuss that, a little bit around the architectural features here. You have archivolts that frame the tympanum, and your text may go into a little bit more depth with this, as well as maybe show you some examples. And these are also supported by jambs on both sides. We're going to be looking at, our next image will show us a close-up of the trumeau at Moissac. And it's a trumeau is a central pier that supported the lintels and archivolts. So important imagery appeared on this tympanum directly above the door. So a little bit about knowledge and the acquisition of knowledge during the Romanesque and during medieval times. There is a tradition of scholasticism, as private, religious, and some state-funded education was available, though usually not free. And of course there was exclusion surrounding this. You had some wealthy women who could attend, but education often reinforced gender difference and limited different levels of education. So you had, of course, Christian cathedrals, schools as well too, monastic schools taught by monks and nuns. And scholasticism applied Aristotelian logic to Christian theology. So the writing of some of the belief of ancient philosophy, particularly the writing of Aristotle, kind of resurfaces, and this is appropriated into monasticism and Christian theology. So, for example, there would be questions, possibly doubting the philosophical issues surrounding Christianity. These may be presented at the beginning of a text or a manuscript, and throughout the text, this would be disputed. You had these disputations, and eventually Christianity and its ideals would be reaffirmed beyond doubt by the end of this disputation. So this had multiple functions. This could assist people who encountered people of other faiths as a reasoning tool to defend Christianity, but of course also reinforce this kind of intellectual drive behind the crusade and its violence. So scholasticism was a system of reasoned analysis that developed in universities and continues through the Gothic. So back to the tympanum. Even with scholasticism, this was not a time of widespread literacy, as previous eras in art would definitely kind of reemerge and revalue literacy maybe as we consider it today. But the church promoted visual literacy through narratives, such as what pilgrims would encounter as they would be confronted with this tympanum. So again, these are the enclosed spaces over a church doorway that reinforces very significant religious narratives. And you often have what we see here, sculpted figural portals, and these are sometimes known as speaking facades, and they're laden with Christian messages, ideas of morality and consequence. And again, this idea this narrative would be recognizable. So this tympanum portrays the Last Judgment. This is a powerful image of Christ in his majesty, and it dominates this as you also have foliate and geometric ornament covering the area. And this is a moment, this Last Judgment is a moment when Christ is believed to call the pious to heaven, as the sinners and heathens would endure into eternity in hell. And we see imagery that would evoke extreme terror. And this really reinforces this idea of behavior and conduct on the pilgrim who would encounter these visual narratives. So what we see here is the viewer is confronted with images like this: Christ portrayed in hieratic scale or hierarchical proportion. This kind of idea still remains relevant. And this, of course, highlights the significance of Christ in the center and the power of Christ, as well as the centrality of this to the specific narrative. And this is just one of the many examples and ways in which Christian messages are displayed in public spaces to viewers who would read a narrative such as this and then be expected to behave according to religious code and maybe embrace this idea of the fear of God. So let's move to the Trumeau here. So here what we see is the Old Testament prophet Jeremiah. And this is on the right side of the Trumeau of the south portal. And what we see here is a very expressive, kind of elongated, graceful form. And we also have this distinction of the contrast between the idea of the contemplative life and the active life. So this Trumeau also features a pair of lions, and the prophet Jeremiah skillfully conforming to these constraints. So the side walls of the porch in front of the portal are filled with figural sculpture such as this. And here we also see this emphasis, as our text kind of reinforces as well too, of subjects who convey human frailties, and this attempt to persuade viewers to follow the church's moral teachings, maybe evoke kind of a sense of compassion in the viewer as well. So this is just another example of some of these multiple narratives that viewers would encounter pilgrims during their pilgrimage routes. Our next image from the study guide is this one that is done by Giselbertus, who was somebody who received a lot of work, is known to have sculpted the tympanum or worked at religious sites and kind of created religious narratives elsewhere during the Romanesque. And here we have Saint Lazare. And we see this on the west tympanum and this detail also at Autun, France. So this is kind of our next image on the list of images here. And this is created sometime around 1130, the Common Era, and of course, again, within the Romanesque style. So this tympanum also portrays a Last Judgment, and art historians believe it may include the artist's signatures under the feet of Christ to the right. So as at Mozac, our previous example we looked at here, Christ dominates the composition at the center. But figures' posture and placement conform to their involvement in the story. Here Christ is shown in his full body, and his full body almond-shaped mandorla, which is this kind of halo that would surround his entire physical being. And again, you see this emphasis on hieratic scale or hierarchical proportion to demonstrate his importance. And you also see multiple narratives additionally through this tympanum. You see references to pilgrims with their shells and associated symbols below Christ here. As you look below, you see some of these pilgrims, and they also have walking sticks. They're identifiable. And additionally here, you have to the left of Christ the pious ascending to heaven and eternal paradise. And to the right of Christ, what we see here, this is the close-up beneath this. This is highlighted on the upper image too. To the right of Christ, Giselbertus has portrayed something more gruesome about the fate of the others. So this is an example of what we also see during this time. We see the emergence of figures sometimes known as grotesques. So gargoyles, for example, might be an example of this. And some people believe they serve that kind of architectural function of the water kind of passing through them. They made that gargling sound, thus the thus the name gargoyle. And some people believe that this was kind of this artistic license that may have been frowned down upon a little bit of artists to kind of deviate a bit from this emphasis solely of religious matter and, into this kind of fantasy grotesque-like realm. But Giselbertus incorporates this into this narrative. So this is something else that's very distinct about this tympanum. We see this emphasis on moral consequence that was communicated to pilgrims as they entered religious spaces such as these. So the moral of sin, again, as we discussed previously, can be easily read from this narrative format and graphic scenes of these so that medieval viewers would relate and take warning to this. And if you look at this close-up here below of this grotesque scene, this could very much evoke terror in a religious viewer, as we see this argued effect of this impact on one's soul of moral transgression and the effect that this could have in this life and follow somebody into eternity in the afterlife. So you see these very kind of like horrific moments here, scenes of demons taking babies, possibly unbaptized ones, weighing souls to determine who will be subjected to damnation according to this narrative. And this brings us to another visual device that we see here, historiated columns as well as letters, which we will look at briefly too. So this historiated, what we see as a capital here, so these could be used and integrated into letters and capitals, ornamented with representations of plants, animals, and various narratives. And here we see the Magi and the Magi asleep. So this is a capital from the Cathedral of Saint Lazare, and this, of course, portrays the Magi asleep, and we see this extent and this elaboration of biblical narratives and religious iconography and storytelling that are even integrated into these historiated capitals. So we're going to look at another example here of a historiated letter this time. So we also see these that would begin sections of manuscripts or stories and tales such as this one. So let's consider a couple of questions about this. What does this portray? Does it serve a purpose beyond narrative and visual pleasure? And does it reinforce values and social etiquette? So feel free to pause this, go back, and you'll see that this is also on your study guide for this section, still in Romanesque art. So what we see here is the story of St. George, slaying the dragon with his shield and lance as he stands above his squire, literally. So you can see his squire actually supporting him. And we see another example here of this kind of hieratic scale, once again showing us the importance of St. George. And of course, St. George does this to protect a maiden. And by doing this, not only reinforces medieval ideas of chivalry, but also promotes the principles of knighthood and loyalty to the state. So we see once again, art is very much reinforcing social conduct. So our text reminds us that knighthood is associated with the crusading barons. And this would be this idealized figure who embarks on this kind of, it's referred to in our text as an ultimate adventure, even though these were quite violent here, for the sake of the state and church, while protecting people who are regarded as being very helpless. So this is why St. George was the national saint of England and the Crusaders' patron. So this manuscript, which reinforces the significance of St. George, ideals of knighthood, the importance of crusades, chivalry, This is also an example of the Cistercian illumination associated with this religious order. But it is also connected to, if you can remember back to the Hiberno-Saxon animal style, such as what we looked at with different forms in Sudden Who, for example, found with the Sudden Who burial. We see you see more examples in your text. We see forms and shapes and colors that are a bit reminiscent of this style. But we also see this drapery. So this may be seen kind of as this hybrid style as well too. We see this drapery with its dovetail folds that communicate movement in this stylistic way, very representative of the Romanesque manner as well too. So let's transition here into the Gothic. And as we turn to Gothic architecture, we'll keep in mind Vasari again. So Vasari is somebody we've discussed who has kind of given this idea of the Middle Ages and named this term Gothic after these, what he considered to be very barbarian tribes such as the Visigoths. And he's somebody who is referenced to in the final chapter of this text, which we won't be able to go into very much in depth. He is very kind of responsible for the way this period that was very oversimplified as the Middle Ages was perceived for a long time here. And not to say that everything that he said was not true, but there is this very kind of qualifying of this time by the Renaissance art historian Vasari, who coins this term Gothic, which had a very negative connotation. But as far as some of these innovations of the Gothic, this of course is an age when many cathedrals were being built around approximately 1150 to 1400, and some of which replaced earlier churches destroyed in fires. So this enormous expense of such large, massive churches sometimes inspired resentment and rioting. And of course you had crime and theft around the holy robberies of the relic as well too. So as we transition to Gothic art, we will be focusing on two architectural sites specifically. We have the Church of Saint-Denis as well as the Cathedral of Chartres. So this scholasticism you read about in your text, of course, is still relevant during this time period. It's referenced again in this chapter on Gothic art. And of course, this really reinforces ideas of the importance of cathedrals and their connection to the state. So let's consider this. We're going to basically frame this very concise, focused discussion around these two sites, considering the answers to this question. What are some of these defining features of Gothic architecture? How is this idea of the importance of architecture as a site for pilgrimages, as local, as reinforcing the local importance of certain regions, and particularly the relics they possessed on a pilgrimage route, and the state's importance, the importance of certain monarchs who are sometimes patrons of these sites as well. We will consider all of this as we look at some of these defining features of Gothic architecture. So our first site in question is Saint-Denis. Saint-Denis was an important burial site for the monarchs, and when this area of France, which was composed of different regions, wanted to expand its church to accommodate pilgrims, this was as much a political move as it was a spiritual one. And we will what we're going to be doing here is, let's look at this emphasis on ribbed vaulting. And I don't believe that I have this term here up on the screen, but this is a term that is on your study guide. And it basically, a very kind of simplified definition of this is, it is the intersection of a church ceiling of 2 or 3 barrel vaults with a pointed peak. And this enabled this emphasis on verticality. And verticality is a very important feature, of course, of the Gothic. And this was also known as the upward leading method. And this was something that Abbot Suger, who was in charge of the renovation of Saint Denis wrote about in his text that he left behind. This is evident in spires reaching to heavens, such as churches and cathedrals, and this verticality, the way this architecture would kind of extend into the heavens, reinforce that it was this idea of the physical embodiment of divinity on earth. So consider this as you look at this ribbed vaulting here, what it enabled as far as verticality. Another feature we'll consider here, very important defining feature, is the use of light and stained glass windows. So Abbot Suger thought he had discovered the writings of the martyred Saint Denis, though he was mistaken. But Suger himself wrote about this church and his vision for expanding it. So what we saw with Romanesque churches previously is that they were dependent upon these thick walls. And Abbot Suger would challenge this with the inclusion of windows and the impact that these windows would have to kind of illuminate men's minds so that they may travel. This is his quote. As he spoke about light theoretically, he described that these lights would, quote, be the most radiant windows to, quote, illuminate men's minds so that they may travel through apprehension of God's light, end quote. And he also spoke of different levels of light. So there was the light of the people, the light of Christ, and the light of God. So we see this through stained glass, but if you also see kind of the way the light enters the interior here, and this is also possible through, of course, opening up this space and kind of clearing away this heavy internal masonry that we saw emphasized with Romanesque, and opening up the space and putting in windows here. So Abbot Suger was very much an advocate of this. And what we also see here is these are the rose windows of Chartres. So this was Saint Denis and this was Chartres. And rose window, as we see a definition here, this is stained glass. These are stained glass windows in a floral shape typical of the Gothic. But we also see religious iconography here as well too. So in this rose window, what we see as we see the entire rose window and then we see close-ups here, this rose window shows us the Virgin and Child, and then above and around them we see symbols of the dove, which is referential to the Holy Spirit. So below this central kind of rose format here, we see 5 larger lancet windows that portray Saint Anne, the mother of the Virgin Mary, with the Virgin, of course, and we see them flanked by 4 of Christ's Old Testament ancestors. So this reinforcement of church and state in France is very referenced here. And the small lancet windows on either side of the main rose window would indicate who the patron was. And in this case, it's Queen Blanche of Castile, who was originally from the Castilian region of Spain before marrying into the French royal family and becoming the mother of Saint Louis. So the inclusion of the fleur-de-lis is very significant as well too. And the fleur-de-lis, of course, the fleur-de-lis became the symbol of France, and the gold castle on the red background was also referential to Castile. So this would have been recognizable, both of these symbols together would have been recognizable as an allusion to the patron of this window, who is Blanche of Castile. Something else about the fleur-de-lis, this became appropriated into religious symbolism, of course, too, in iconography. And this is known as the lily flower. And this is why we often see, if you take Art 5, you'll see, Art History 5, you'll see that Annunciation scenes where the angel Gabriel is coming to the Virgin Mary and telling her that she is going to, she through Immaculate Conception will bear Christ. You often see her holding a lily during this Annunciation scene. So the lily for centuries was a symbol used to indicate purity. And we see this here. We see all of these references in this particular rose window. But you also see, too, something that is very distinctive of rose windows too during this time. This deep color blue is the color that is associated with the Virgin Mary, and also a symbol of purity. And you see the glass plates of the window within this tracery kind of emphasize this color, as well as the color red, which is often referential to the passion and martyrdom of Christ. So now we look at the concern of buttresses. We look at another very defining feature of the Gothic. So we've looked at the inclusion of light, especially through the writing of Saint Denis, and we also considered as well too ribbed vaulting, emphasis on verticality as well too, and how this was kind of reinforced, how the renovation of certain cathedrals that would house relics, that these would kind of reinforce state power, as we have all of these different city-states. And now we're going to look at buttresses here as we see this external feature, but one that was very important to the architecture of this time. So here we see a buttress on the right, and we discuss this emphasis on verticality of these religious structures that extend to the heavens, as well as this very heavy stained glass that open cathedrals to light. So another structural innovation during this time that was enabling this was the buttress. So here we see on the left, you don't see the buttresses as much here, but on the left we have the facade of Chartres. And on the right of this, of course, is this example of a flying buttress that would redistribute the weight of the wall. And these heavy windows of this wall and all of this masonry would somehow complicate the weight of these structures. And elements such as buttresses would redistribute the weight so that these walls would not kind of buckle and collapse into themselves or implode, basically. So, of course, these buttresses became incorporated into the aesthetic of different cathedrals as well. And you can see some that are more illustrious at the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. So, of course, with that one, you can walk under them and really interact with that space externally, kind of on the rooftops below these buttresses and around them. So now we look at kind of our last concern here of the Gothic. And even though this is a very kind of, concise review here of some of the key ideas focused on our study guide, there is a lot more in this chapter, but again, we're focusing on some core ideas here. So inside Chartres, what we see here is on the left, you have the form of the Latin cross. And basically we have a couple of additional vocabulary terms. You have cruciform, which is in the shape of a Latin cross, and we've seen this, through Romanesque Gothic art as well as earlier. And you also have this idea we've discussed too, this vocabulary term of the relic, which of course, again, is the bodily fragment or object that has come in contact with the body of a holy figure. So what we see here is this emphasis on relics is very significant to these cathedrals and would draw these pilgrims and would justify some of these structures that were controversial to be built. The cult of the Virgin became very important and was very important during the Gothic. And Chartres has this very important relic believed to be the tunic of the Virgin Mary. And this is what we see on the right. So this, of course, is what the Virgin wore, and it was believed that she may have worn this when she gave birth to Christ. This is believed to be a relic that came in contact with her and is connected to the Virgin, as well as this idea of her Immaculate Conception in relation to Christ. So this specific relic increased the importance of this cathedral as a pilgrimage site. And when Chartres Cathedral was burnt, a horrible fire happened there, people were very concerned that the tunic was destroyed in the fire. But this relic was rediscovered shortly after, and it was believed as we once again return to this Christian belief in miracles, that the Virgin had rescued this tunic, this relic, because she wanted this larger cathedral, which would feature this relic and also allow pilgrims to kind of interact and engage with a larger renovated cathedral. So we're going to stop there. And again, this was just a concise review of examples and key ideas of Romanesque and then Gothic architecture. If you have any questions about anything else from these sections, let me know and I can elaborate and provide you with more resources. Okay, goodbye.